Can the Sacramento Kings win an NBA championship within the next 5 seasons? Let's get into this. Quickly before we get the video started, if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more NBA content just like this one, hit that subscribe button and that post notification bell. Anyways, back to the video. For a very long time now, the Sacramento Kings have been known as one of those organizations that are just a laughingstock. They've never truly been anywhere near the NBA playoffs. Basically, the Kings have been in a bad place for a very long time now. It comes down to a bunch of different reasons, but just to list out a few for why the Kings have been so bad for so long, the first issue would be drafting. Of course, drafting is probably one of the most important things you can do as an organization. If you find and identify the right players in the draft, no matter where you draft, that's really going to help your organization going forward. And if you find a guy that's great, then your team is probably going to be pretty good for a long time. But if you have a high draft pick and don't draft the right player, it's really going to push your team back some years. And that's exactly what happened to the Sacramento Kings. There was a bunch of years where they had pretty high draft picks. They were at the bottom of the league in terms of standings for a long time, basically year after year. But even when the Kings had a pretty high draft pick, either in the top 5 or top 10, or even in the lottery at the very least, which they basically were in every single year, they were just never able to draft the right players. Either they would draft a guy that was a complete bust and he just didn't play well for them whatsoever, or they would draft a guy either with a top 5 pick or wherever that maybe is okay in the NBA, but when you're drafting a guy that high in the draft, you expect him to be a little bit more than what he was actually providing for you. So the first issue for why the Kings were so poor for so long was drafting. The next issue is just staff hires. There's so many different people that you can hire within your organization. Some fans don't even know the amount of positions there are, and I don't even know all the positions, but there's some positions specifically that are extremely important that the Kings were just not able to nail. Of course, the first most important thing you can do in your organization is hire a competent and a good president of basketball operations, which is something that the Kings kind of struggled with. Next after that is a general manager, which the Kings didn't necessarily have a great general manager for a long time, of course. Then you talk about a head coach, assistant head coaches, and now you talk about some smaller positions within the team, but each position that you hire is obviously going to be very important. But over the years, I think it's clear that the Kings didn't necessarily make the right hires, and that's obviously going to have a huge effect on your roster and in terms of you actually being able to win an NBA championship or even really doing anything in the NBA. Hiring the right people in the right positions will lead to winning, but contrary to that, not hiring the right people in the right positions will obviously lead to losing. Now, the next issue for the Kings for why they weren't able to win for a very long time is what they were able to do in free agency. Free agency is a time either where you find a superstar player to join your team, or if you have a pretty good roster already going for you and you have some nice rookies on your team and nice young players, you add some role players within your team like shooting. Maybe you add a guy who plays great defense. Maybe you add a point guard that you need on your roster to get everybody playing better and really everyone organized. But the Kings obviously were never able to get this down right either. And during free agency, they would either strike out if they're trying to go for a superstar or just not bring in the right players to truly complement the young guys they might have had at that point in time. So overall, when you combine all these things together, that's basically the reason why the Kings have not been good for so long. But it appears that recently the Sacramento Kings are finally starting to change their ways and actually going in the right direction for once. When you actually look at the Kings roster, you actually see a pretty nice up-and-coming roster they have. They have some really nice talented young players, but just specifically talking about some players, of course you got De'Aaron Fox, who just signed a very big contract with the Sacramento Kings, which by the way he definitely deserved. He's definitely going to be a very good player going forward, and he's already proven himself to be a very good player in the NBA. And I'm excited to see what he can do for the Kings going forward. But also when you talk about other guys, a guy like Buddy Hield, who for some reason has been in trade rumors, to me personally is a little confusing. I think Buddy Hield's a very good, nice young player going forward. He's a great shooter, which every NBA team of course always needs going forward. And it appears on the offensive side of the ball, he's not just a 3-and-D kind of guy. He's also a guy who can create from that 3-point range. He can create for himself in general, and he's a nice secondary player alongside De'Aaron Fox in my opinion. But as I said, he's been in so many different trade rumors, so maybe he will get traded eventually. We'll see what happens with Buddy Hield, but currently he is on the Kings roster, and for his sake and for the Kings' sake, I hope he definitely does stay with them because I think he's a really good player going forward. But also when you look at the roster, you see another guy like Tyrese Halliburton, who was drafted 9th overall a few seasons back, and he's actually been a very good pick for them. He's almost been a steal. Coming into the NBA, he was always seen as a guy who was a great defender, which he has been in the NBA, but something that he's definitely improved and impressed upon is his offensive abilities. He's been a very good 3-point shooter actually, which is something coming into the the NBA was seen as a negative for him, his three-point shooting. So that's kind of crazy to see the contrast. But also, even besides that, both his confidence and his ability to create for himself on the offensive side of the ball has just been so impressive. But besides him, you got a guy like Davion Mitchell, who they just drafted in this previous draft, who me personally, I think he's going to be a pretty good player going forward. I think it's very funny that his name is very similar to Donovan Mitchell. He looks like Donovan Mitchell, he has the same number as Donovan Mitchell, but he also kind of plays like Donovan Mitchell. I don't think he's necessarily going to be as good, but when you look at his actual game in terms of his three-point shooting ability, his athleticism, ability to get to the basket, dunk over some people, I think he has a very similar game to Donovan Mitchell. And based upon that, I think Davion Mitchell is actually going to be a pretty good player going forward. So I personally think the Kings definitely made the right selection in drafting Davion Mitchell this season. You look at some other players on the roster, you talk about a guy like Marvin Bagley, who was drafted with a number 2 overall pick a few seasons back. Now, of course, Bagley's career with the Kings definitely hasn't been great up until this point. He's definitely been seen as a bust at this point. He hasn't been playing nearly as well as he should be playing for being the number 2 overall pick. And especially when you look at the players that were drafted under him, it just makes their situation even worse and the pressure on Marvin Bagley a lot higher. But even though Marvin Bagley isn't playing up to the standards of a typical number 2 overall pick, I definitely still do think there are some promising signs with Marvin Bagley going forward. In terms of his mid-range jump shot, him extending his range all the way out to that corner 3-point jump shot, the ability to be mobile on the defensive side of the ball as well as the offensive side of the ball. You can definitely run the pick and pop with him. I definitely think there are some promising signs for Marvin Bagley going forward, but there also has been a ton of trade rumors revolving Marvin Bagley's name, so maybe he won't even be on the Kings roster in a few seasons, or maybe after next season he won't be on the roster, so we'll definitely see what happens with him going forward as well. But now getting to the question of the video, which is, could this Sacramento Kings roster actually win an NBA championship within the next 5 seasons? So now, of course, as I mentioned before in the video, I definitely think this Sacramento Kings roster is going in the right direction in terms of the players they were able to bring in. I think basically when you look at all the players, they're all drafted by the Kings, which is definitely a good thing because, of course, one, they're homegrown, but also all these players are basically on team-friendly contracts going forward. So now you can go into the offseason and maybe sign a pretty good free agent if they're willing to come there. But first, you have to show some progress. Besides De'Aaron Fox, of course, he just recently signed a huge contract, and maybe a few other guys that I'm missing. They may have signed new contracts with the Kings. But basically, everybody on this Kings roster is a nice, young, up-and-coming player, which is definitely nice to see going forward. And you would expect these guys to get better each and every season if they truly do put in the work. And obviously, some players in this team I really do believe in, and I think they will get better each and every season. The one issue with the Kings, I will say, although, is 2 seasons back, they actually showed great progress, and they were actually able to make it all the way up to the 9th seed in the Western Conference. And they almost got into that 8th seed and almost made the playoffs, but unfortunately, they did fall a little bit short. But then this previous season, they took a little bit of a step back, and they had a pretty down year. So hopefully, this next up-and-coming season, they can get right back on track and maybe finally make the playoffs. But of course, when you're talking about winning an NBA championship within the next 5 seasons, it's obviously a big difference from just making the playoffs. So of course, the first step you want to see from the Kings is actually make the playoffs, of course. And I think they're definitely going to make the playoffs within the next 5 seasons at the very least. But after making the playoffs, you want to see some progress. Maybe the first time they make the playoffs, maybe it would just be a first-round exit. But now you have experience for all these young players, which is obviously very valuable going forward. And then maybe the next season, they can be a little bit better during the regular season, maybe be a higher seed in the Western Conference, then make the playoffs and maybe actually win a playoff series, maybe win 2 playoff series, and then eventually make it all the way up and win an NBA championship. Now, that's obviously the ideal goal and the ideal progress for this Kings team, but will that actually happen? I'm not so sure. I think they definitely have some nice players on their team, but I think in order to win an NBA championship, you at the very least need to have 2 superstars on your team. Probably at this point in the NBA, you probably need to have 3 superstars on your team. And when you look at the Kings roster, I think De'Aaron Fox is becoming a star in this league. I don't necessarily think he's there yet. I think he's basically at that borderline all-star level, but I think you need at the very least 1, 2, maybe 3 superstars on your team. So let's just say for the sake of the video that De'Aaron Fox does get to that superstar level within the next 5 seasons. So there, bam, you have 1. Then you have Davion Mitchell. Maybe he can get there. That's kind of a long shot at this point. I think he's going to be a good player, but I don't necessarily think he's going to be a superstar player going forward. Hopefully he will prove me wrong, but I think you're really going to have to show some promise, and going into one of these free agencies, you're going to actually have to bring in one of these star free agents into your organization. Maybe 2 guys. Maybe if one guy comes over, then another guy would be intrigued and come with him to the Sacramento Kings. I think that's really the only way this Kings roster actually does win an NBA championship within the next 5 seasons. Now, of course, another scenario that can go the Kings' way and make them an NBA championship contender at the very least within the next 5 seasons is some of of the players on the roster that we don't otherwise expect to become superstars in the NBA do become superstars. Maybe a guy like Marvin Bagley, who was supposed to be a superstar once he got drafted to the NBA with the number 2 overall pick, finally starts to figure everything out and plays very well for the Kings and becomes a superstar in the league. Maybe a guy like Davion Mitchell does become a superstar in this league. I definitely think he has the potential to get there, but I think it's kind of tough to put those kind of expectations on a guy coming into the NBA without even playing a single game. But maybe a guy like Tyrese Halliburton turns into a superstar going forward. There's just always a potential when you have a bunch of young players on your roster that all have promise. There's always a potential that one of the guys that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have expected, maybe that guy does become a superstar going forward. So if that's the case for the Kings, obviously it makes it a lot easier for them to win a championship. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys think the Sacramento Kings roster could win an NBA championship within the next 5 seasons, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.